May I introduce our speaker, Art Batson, who needs nor deserves an introduction. Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Art, for that heartwarming introduction. And I wish to thank the UCLA Symphony Orchestra for that stirring, emotional rendition of Also Spoke Darwin. It's a little inter-campus humor there. I'm sure they'll get even with me before the day is out. Well, our subject today, I'll be right back. We didn't want to hear any more from the UCLA Symphony Orchestra there. Our topic today is the theory of conservation. Darwin had a subtitle to his major work, and I do as well. It's on the likelihood that purely naturalistic and mechanistic processes inhibit major evolutionary change. This, ladies and gentlemen, may be my last lecture. This lecture is inspired by the words and works of a number of people, and if you happen not to see your name on the list, it's not that I haven't been greatly influenced by your work, it's just that I'm in enough trouble with these people. I would also like to give special thanks to the National Academy of Scientism. Oh, there goes my grant. We're not taping this, are we? We are. Oh. Well, I'd like to honor my second grade teacher at this point in time by saying that whenever you introduce a new term, that you define it and use it in a sentence. Unfortunately, I used the Reader's Digest version of a dictionary, and it says, see materialism. So when we look up the word materialism, we find it to mean the doctrine that everything in the world, including thought, can be explained only in terms of matter. There was a second definition that said something about lack of concern about things spiritual or intellectual, but we're not going to go there. Richard Lewontin on materialism. This is the sentence. My second grade teacher didn't say that I had to use my sentence. I'm going to use his sentence. Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. I'm not making this up. These are his actual words. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. There, Mrs. Nakamura, is your sentence. But he continues, it is not that the methods and the institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Now, I agree with Professor Lewontin that when it comes to the operation of things that have been, dare I use the C word here, that have been created or that exist already, that we do not call upon the divine hand to explain that. However, when it comes to the subject of origins, I think we must leave the door open. Douglas Futuyma on materialism. Darwin showed that material causes are a sufficient explanation not only for physical phenomena, as Descartes and Newton had shown, but also for biological phenomena with all their seeming evidence of design and purpose. By coupling undirected, purposeless variation to the blind, uncaring process of natural selection, Darwin made theological or spiritual explanations of life processes superfluous. Together with Marx's materialistic theory of history and society and Freud's attribution of human behavior to influences over which we have little control, Darwin's theory of evolution was a crucial plank in the platform of mechanism and materialism, of much of science in short, that has been the stage of most Western thought. Now, I know what you're thinking. Marx, Freud, Darwin, 2 down, 1 to go. But before the end of this talk, I think you will find that Darwin is the hero of the story. More to come. Materialism, if I can interpret the 2 previous quotes correctly, may be summed up by this statement. I believe that absolutely everything came into existence out of absolutely nothing, with absolutely no reason and for absolutely no purpose. This is for the physicists. Now, for the philosophers have a corollary. I further believe that there are absolutely no absolutes. Materialism, noun, leads us to this question. How can the origin of time, space, matter, and energy be explained without reference to pre-existing time, space, matter, and energy? Another way of asking the question is, who put the material in materialism? I knew that you'd want an answer to that, so I went to the person that put the material in materialism last week, and I asked him, and he said, well, have them use their own material on their own time, in their own space, using their own energy. It's okay, I'll deliver that message, however unpopular it might be. Getting into the subject of origins again, my recommendation is that we always approach the question of origins systematically, beginning with the origin of the universe, the origin of life and genetic information, the origin of the major body plans, that is the origin of phyla, and ultimately the origin of species. Last night, we dealt with the topic of the origin of the universe. Today, we will find out that there are populations of black and white, light and dark moths that evolved into populations of dark and light moths. and that there are finches that evolved into finches, which totally overturns Mike's conclusions last night. There was a designer of the universe. The origin of the universe, just a quick summary for those who did not attend last night. There are a number of elements that are relevant to the question of the origin of the universe: the second law of thermodynamics, Einstein's theory of relativity, Hubble's observation of an expanding universe, and the cosmic background radiation. The conclusion that scientists come to is that time, space, matter, and energy have not always existed. The universe did have a moment of creation, and that science and theology at this point converge with the simple phrase, "In the beginning, God created." Sir Fred Hoyle, an agnostic, wrote, "A common-sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a superintellect has monkeyed with the physics as well as with the chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The number one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question." Albert Einstein, "The scientist is possessed by the sense of universal causation. His religious feeling takes the form of a rapturous amazement at the harmony of natural law, which reveals an intelligence of such superiority that compared with it, all the systematic thinking and acting of human beings is an utterly insignificant reflection." Alan Sandage, "We can't understand the universe in any clear way without the supernatural." Logical conclusion: mind preceded matter. Second, if the origin of the universe was a result of an intelligence of such superiority that compared with it, all the systematic thinking and acting of human beings is an utterly insignificant reflection, then certainly the origin of species is also an utterly insignificant reflection. Now, the materialist's final refuge is this: a nearly infinite number of universes must exist such that the exquisite fine-tuning evident in our universe is probable in at least one of them. An example of this would be the expansion rate of the Big Bang at 10 to the minus 34 seconds after the initiation of the very finely tuned bang, if you will. It must be fine-tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 60th. Now, I've got a note here that says, also see the Chicago theory. Now, there weren't any members of this panel that we were going to have today, too, that were familiar with the Chicago theory, so I'll have to define that as well. It's actually this Chicago Cubs theory of multi-universes. And that's a theory that an infinite number of universes must exist such that in at least one of them, the Chicago Cubs have won each and every World Series. See also the Boston theory. I'm not going to go into detail on the Boston theory. Just let me say that there are Harvard scientists working at the moment to try to calculate the number of universes that can dance on the head of a pin. Well, it's Saturday. They may not actually be doing it at this time, but by Monday they'll be back at work on this theory. Henry Schaefer down at the University of Georgia had just this to say. This is writing an awfully big check on a non-existent bank account. Something to ponder. Well, the origin of life. Question arises, why hasn't anything ever crawled out of Stanley Miller's apparatus? Well, scientists have said that the simplest theoretical life form would probably consist of well over 100 proteins. We'll use 100 just as a rough figure here. And that the average protein may contain 300 left-handed amino acids. Now, in Stanley Miller's flask, of course, he had a racemic mixture of left and right-handed. And a random combination of these building blocks would actually inhibit a naturalistic origin of life if they were to combine. An average protein may contain 300 L amino acids, but the odds of forming a protein then with all L amino acids would be 2 raised to the 300th power. Now, in both the standard closed model and the SSM, there are about 10 to the 80th electrons in the universe. There's about 10 to the 18th seconds, so there's only so much time, space, material for random events to occur. And in the SSM, then, the number of electrons is determined to be exactly 2 raised to the 266th power. Therefore, the odds of finding a specific electron in the entire universe by chance are 1 in 2 raised to the 266th power. This implies that the probability of forming a single functional protein of 300 amino acids out of a mixture of left and right-handed amino acids is roughly equal to the odds of finding one specific electron out of an ensemble of over 17 trillion universes by chance. Now, of course, it happened, and although we're not willing to bet $1 on it, we're willing to bet our lives on it. Jacques Monod wrote this. He says, the modern cell's translating machinery consists of at least 50 macromolecular components, which are themselves coded in DNA. Now, the code cannot be translated otherwise than by the products of translation. In other words, here you have this software. You have a piece of hardware. You need the hardware to decode the software, and yet the hardware is coded in that software. Which came first, the computer or software? When and how did the circle become closed? It is exceedingly difficult to imagine. Life itself is probably an example of irreducible complexity. Fred Hoyle again, the agnostic cosmologist. The likelihood of the formation of life from inanimate matter is 1 to a number with 40,000 naughts after it. It is big enough to bury Darwin and the whole theory of evolution. Working on down the ladder from the origin of the universe, the origin of life. Well, we're covering a lot of ground here, folks. The origin of the phyla, the major groups, the major body plans, for the one individual that may not be a biologist in here, the animal kingdom is divided into phyla, and beneath that, subdivided into classes, orders, family, genera, and then finally species. Now, neo-Darwinian evolution predicts that a gradually increasing diversity of species through time will ultimately produce the disparity or the major differences that one finds among the phyla. The pervasive pattern in the major prediction of Darwinian theory should be bottom to top, bottom up. Species to multiple species to form different genera, which would ultimately form families, orders, classes, and finally, when enough morphological distance has been generated, new phyla. Now, the rules of materialistic evolution are these. The arrival of the fittest must ultimately be attributed to chance. But the survival of the fittest must also be attributed to an environment which ultimately arose out of nothing but chance. So the mechanism is the chance selection of chance variations. When we look at the origin of the phyla, it can best be understood in 2 terms that Stephen Jay Gould has outlined in his book, Wonderful Life. Diversity relates to the number of distinct species in a group. Rodents, for example, have, 10,000 species or so. High diversity. Horses, zebras, very small diversity. The disparity relates to the major differences in the body plans. If we were thinking of created things, computers might be in a different phylum than automobiles, than garbage disposals. These are bad examples, but you get my point. Diversity and disparity. Stephen Jay Gould says this about it. Okay? Under a Darwinian paradigm, remember, diversity ought to precede disparity. It says, using this terminology, we may acknowledge a central and surprising fact of life's history, decrease in disparity, it's odd, followed by an outstanding increase in diversity within the few surviving designs. This fact embodies a central paradox of early life. How could so much disparity in body plans evolve in the apparent absence of substantial diversity in numbers of species? For the two are correlated, more or less, in lockstep by the iconography of the cone. Here's a picture, an icon of the cone, Darwin's Tree of Life. Notice we start at the bottom with a single species, and we gradually branch and form different genera, ultimately forming new phyla. The predicted pattern is bottom to top. Punctuated equilibria, developed by Niles Eldredge and Stephen Gould, also has a bottom to top prediction. Remember, the jumps can't be so great as to leave one without a mate, so there are population genetics that play a role here, but the pattern is still bottom to top. When we look at the fossil evidence, however, the pattern is backwards. Certainly every phylum contains a species, at least one species. However, the pattern is top down. I've got a little problem. The theory says this. The data says this. What did Darwin do when he held his theory in one hand and the data in another? He was well aware of this. He wasn't aware that it was maybe quite as bad as the Cambrian explosion today shows that it is. But what did he do about this? Now, this is close enough for government research. Sorry, there goes my NSF grant again. But Darwin chose to throw away the data. Now, he did this with another finger, but this is only an R-rated program. It may contain religious content. We're not going to go into the X direction, if you get my drift. Irwin, Valentine, and Sepkoski said this. The fossil records suggest that the major pulse of the diversification of, actually they said it a little clearer than that. They said, they said the fossil records suggest that the major pulse of diversification of phyla occurs before that of classes, classes before that of orders, and orders before families. The higher taxa do not seem to have diverged through an accumulation of lower taxa. This is what the data says. What we find is that the disparity of the phyla appears before the diversity of species. What's wrong with this picture? In the Cambrian explosion, we have very few examples of species in each of the phyla. There are estimates that there were over 50 phyla at that time, where we have just over 30 today, so the disparity has actually decreased through time. And even Richard Dawkins says the Cambrian strata of rocks, vintage 600 million years, maybe his latest version says 525, are the oldest ones in which we find most of the major invertebrate groups. And we find many of them already in an advanced state of evolution, the very first time they appear. It is as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. The natural history of life looks more like a forest than a tree, but this cannot be. Valentine and Irwin. We conclude that the probability that species selection is a general solution to the origin of higher taxa is not great, and that neither of the contending theories of evolutionary change at the species level, phyletic gradualism or punctuated equilibrium, seem applicable to the origin of new body plans. Snapshot of today's planet. Again, disparity precedes diversity. We get diversity following, not preceding, the origin of the major groups. We've finally reached the theory of conservation. I hope we have time to discuss this. This is what I consider to be Darwin's greatest insight. I'm not going to let you read it yet. Darwin developed his origin of species over decades, between his visit to the Galapagos Islands and the final publishing of The Origin of Species in 1859. No doubt he had his doubts along the way, and as most of you know, authors write the introduction to their work after they have written their book. You read it the other way, but authors write this. And Darwin did this as well. So he writes in the introduction to his Origin of Species, after having read it like nobody else has read it, he says this: I am well aware that there is scarcely a single point discussed in this volume on which facts cannot be adduced, often apparently leading to conclusions directly opposite to those at which I have arrived. A fair result could be obtained only by fully stating and balancing the facts on both sides of each question, and this cannot possibly be done here. Well, folks, it can't possibly be done here either. We don't have enough time. You noticed I've lent my watch to Peter. I gave my tie to Scott. I gave my coat to Mike. And John has my pants, which is the reason I'm standing behind this lectern right now. Evidence and theory. Usually evidence is important to science, but it's not to Darwinian theory. Why would I say such a heretical thing? All right. At the top of the dotted line here, the line, the Cambrian explosion, is the fossil evidence, the data. Below that line are little round circles that signify Darwinian theory. Now, normally, theory explains data we do have. In this case, the theory explains data we don't and becomes a catch-all for excuses for the reasons that we don't find that data. The fossil record is imperfect, the theory isn't. On stasis and conservation, the talk today was inspired primarily by Darwin's quote in The Origin of Species that one can come to directly opposite conclusions, and also by Eldridge and Gould's work on punctuated equilibria. In an article in the 70s, Gould writes, "The history of most fossil species includes two features particularly inconsistent with gradualism. One is stasis. Most species exhibit no directional change during their tenure on Earth. They appear in the fossil record looking much the same as when they disappear, and morphological change is usually limited and directionless. Two, sudden appearance. In any local area, a species does not arise gradually by the steady transformation of its ancestors. It appears all at once and fully formed." If we look at these two key features of natural history, stasis and sudden appearance, number one, stasis is empirical. It is observable in the fossil record. There are developmental, genetic, and ecological factors, including natural selection itself, that contribute to stasis. It is most definitely subject to scientific investigation. On the other hand, sudden appearance, the origin of life, and the origin and disparity of phyla may or may not be the result of purely natural or secondary causes. Now, for the materialist, item 2, my comments on item 2 on sudden appearance would be blasphemy. To the theist, who has a more open scientific worldview than the materialist does, the origin of the major body plans, the origin of life, may not have been the result of purely naturalistic processes, and in fact, there may be natural and purely mechanistic processes that would inhibit major evolutionary change from occurring. Now, one does not have to be a theist to accept item 2 here, that it may or may not have been the result of purely natural or secondary causes. One only has to be an agnostic, okay? Not knowing whether or not. And this is really the true spirit of science, it would seem to me, not materialism. Stephen Jay Gould, stasis is data. Stasis or non-change of most fossil species during their lengthy geological lifespans was tacitly acknowledged by all paleontologists, but almost never studied explicitly because prevailing theory treated stasis as uninteresting non-evidence for non-evolution. The overwhelming prevalence of stasis became an embarrassing feature of the fossil record, best left ignored as a manifestation of nothing. That is, non-evolution. This is Stephen Jay Gould. Eldridge. Darwin's prediction of rampant, albeit gradual change affecting all lineages through time is refuted. The record is there, and the record speaks for tremendous anatomical conservatism. Changes in the manner Darwin expected is just not found in the fossil record. Anatomical conservatism requires a theory. Eldridge again. The observation that species are amazingly conservative and static entities throughout long periods of time has all the qualities of the emperor's new clothes. Everyone knew it, but preferred to ignore it. Paleontologists faced with a recalcitrant record obstinately refusing to yield Darwin's predicted pattern simply looked the other way. Stephen Jay Gould, in case we don't all have the point yet. We must understand that nothing happens most of the time, and we don't, because our stories don't admit this theme, if we hope to grasp the dynamics of evolutionary change. Now, he says this sentence may sound contradictory, but it isn't. To know the reasons for infrequent change, one must understand the ordinary rules of stability. Well, it seems to me the job of the scientist is to describe nature's ordinary rules. I had a chance several years ago to interview Dr. James Valentine, who was here at UCSB a number of years ago. He's currently up at Berkeley. And this is the question I asked him. Do we need theories of stasis in order to fully explain the natural history of life on Earth?
Yeah, certainly we do. Good question. Yeah, when it dawned on everyone that Eldridge and Gould were right and that stasis was a very common pattern, why everyone rushed back to the drawing boards and began figuring out what the processes were that would prevent change rather than push it along. And I guess there are two chief ideas. One would be ecological, that is that things are constrained ecologically and there's no particular place for them to go. And the other would be developmental, that there are developmental constraints that tend to prevent change until you break through, punctuate the equilibrium, so to speak, and then you can make a jump to a new morphology. But the developmental processes tend to get canalized to produce a particular small range of phenotypes, and it's hard to break out.
Søren Løvtrup, the Swedish biologist, had this to say about Darwinian theory. He said the reasons for rejecting the proposal were many, but first of all, that many innovations cannot possibly come into existence through the accumulation of many small steps. And even if they can, natural selection cannot accomplish it because incipient and intermediate stages are not advantageous. One gets the sense of why Darwin himself should have come to directly opposite conclusions. I knew that Scott Minnick would be giving a talk on the bacterial flagellum today, so I'm going to use that. An example that Mike Behe uses, just a little different perspective on it.
The bacterial flagellum is literally an outboard motor that bacteria use to swim through solution. It's a rotary device. And this is the propeller surface, and it rotates. And it's held onto the drive shaft here by this universal joint made up of something called hook protein. And the apparatus is held in place in the bacterial membrane by this stator. And the motor this is a rotary motor, which is the rotating part, which turns the drive shaft, which turns the propeller. And it has to go through the bacterial membrane, so there are a number of different bushing proteins to allow it to penetrate the membrane. Genetic studies have shown that over 50 different separate protein parts are required to produce a flagellum. About 20 go into making up the structure of the flagellum, and another 30 are needed to coordinate the genes to turn on and off at the right time in order to build this massive structure within the bacterium. The flagellum is irreducibly complex too. If it's not for the propeller, you would not get any motion when it rotated. If it's not for the stator, the device would rotate in the membrane itself, and of course, not for the motor or the bushing proteins, the device would not work either. In the absence of any of those 50 different components, You do not get a flagellum that works half as well or a quarter as well again. You have a broken flagellum. I'd just like to point out that I like to use this illustration, which is from a popular biochemistry textbook written by Voet and Voet, because when people look at this, they can immediately see that this is a machine. It's not like a machine. It is a machine. Now, there are many other examples of such systems which have this property of irreducible complexity and which are subsequently a strong challenge to Darwinian gradualism.
Back to Darwin's greatest insight, that one can come to directly opposite conclusions. Darwin pointed out in The Descent of Man that natural selection would preserve those individuals that were least encumbered with a superfluous part. But each component in this bacterial flagellum is highly specialized in its function. Eliminate a component, and the flagellum fails to function. It's an example of irreducible complexity, what Darwin considered to be the greatest challenge, besides paleontology and the fossil record, to his theory. The conclusion that I draw is that Darwinian natural selection acts to inhibit major evolutionary change from occurring by eliminating useless incipient stages. It thus accounts for the systematic discontinuities we find throughout the fossil record. Now, microevolution, Darwin was right on the money, right? It helps organisms avoid extinction by tracking environmental changes and thus accounts for the conservation of species. Microevolution, thus, can be extrapolated to account for not macroevolution, but macrostasis, stability at higher taxonomic levels. And I'd use Darwin's finches as a good example of macrostasis. There's a number of varieties that allow the finches to survive, but a finch is a finch is a finch. Concluding thoughts. We're close to lunch. Yes, for those of you whose stomachs I haven't turned yet, stay tuned, we're close. All right, well, within a materialistic worldview, theories of origins are unfalsifiable. Chance acts as a god that is called upon to explain time, space, matter, energy, and all biological information. This is not falsifiable, it's a philosophical presupposition. On the basis of materialism or atheism, no data at all is required to come to the conclusion that evolution is unplanned and undirected because no other options are possible by definition. Why would anyone call this science when absolutely no data is needed to come to this conclusion? Ironically, within a theistic worldview, theories of evolution are potentially falsifiable and hence scientific. Now, this is not the only criteria for science, to be sure, because it's empirically possible that natural processes exist which would prevent the origin of life or the origin of the phyla from occurring without direct intelligent input, which we cannot exclude as a historical or empirical possibility on the basis of our philosophical presuppositions. Well, materialists can, but scientists should not. Unfortunately, I have concluding thoughts, not just a single thought, but they're not many, we're close here. If evolution is either programmed into the laws and initial conditions of the universe, if it's yet another example of fine-tuning, or as a result of direct intelligent input through time, that is, progressive creation, then evolution itself, like the evolution of computer software or the evolution of automobiles, would allow us to think God's thoughts after him. Evolution may not be entirely natural, but stasis or conservation most definitely is. Scientists do need to develop a theory of conservation based upon paleontology, as we've seen, as well as genetics, developmental biology, and ecological factors. Someone mentioned to me last week that they thought our Department of Evolution and Ecology was an oxymoron. Wasn't very kind of them. What they had in mind was ecology, of course, as conservation, evolution as being lack of conservation, or evolution and so forth being opposites of each other. So we're changing the name to the Department of Evolution and/or Ecology. I'm sorry. I told you this would be my last lecture, and maybe my last day at work here at UCSB. Concluding thoughts. Okay, the universe has not always existed. The Big Bang points to a moment of creation. Life has not always existed. And ironically, any theory of chemical or biological evolution points to exactly the same thing, a moment of creation. Questions to ponder. Who put the material in materialism? Who finely tuned our finely tuned universe? Who overcame the law of biogenesis that life only arises from pre-existing life? And who punctuated the equilibria? The final word, the final slide. From Francis Bacon, the father of the scientific method. No one should maintain that a man can search too far or be too well studied in the book of God's word or in the book of God's works, divinity or philosophy. But rather, let us all endeavor an endless progress or proficience in both. Thank you.
Thank you, Art. We have some time for questions while they're getting the lunch set up outside. So anybody, feel free to, and please use the
Okay.
microphone.
What I would like to do at this time is actually have a competent scientist on the stage as well, and I would feel even more comfortable with two. So I would like the Q&A session actually to include both Dr. Scott Minnick and Dr. Mike Strauss, if they're both here. So would you join me on stage as my bodyguards, if nothing else? Those of you with tomatoes, if you'd kindly take them out of the cans before you throw them.
We have no tomatoes for the lunch outside.
I'd appreciate that. Yes, good.
Do you want your jacket back now?
Yeah. Thanks, Mike. Yeah, John, I will take those pants. Yes.
Thanks, Art, for that presentation. I'm still laughing. I want to ask
Are the mics up for the questions here? Can you hear those? Speak a
I'd
little
like to ask the scientist about the final chapter, The Puzzle of Perfection, in Michael Denton's book, Evolution, a Theory in Crisis. That book was kind of exciting to me because it never mentioned God, yet when you came to that final chapter, even though God is never mentioned in the book, you come to the conclusion that there has to be God. And in the Puzzle of Perfection, Michael Denton talks about the so-called simple cell. And he paints this picture of the simple cell as this enormous mothership, like a spaceship with portals opening and closing, and these machines moving, nano mechanisms or whatever they are. And as I read it, it was hard for me to decide, is this a metaphor he's using, or is he really illustrating something? Because not only do these things happen in sequence, but it seems that they happen simultaneously, like there is this concert of mechanisms operating like an orchestra, and is there behind that orchestra a conductor? So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that final chapter, or that vision that Michael Denton gives us of the simple cell, because I was just blown away when I read that book and when I came to that final chapter. And I closed that last page and I said to myself, this man has not talked once about God, but you cannot come away from this book without knowing God exists.
Mm-hmm. I believe Michael Denton was an agnostic at the time that he wrote that book. But to help answer your question, I'm going to have Scott Minnick address that while I bring the orchestra that you're talking about up. I'll be right back.
Well, that's a good point. And I think that's why Bruce Alberts is saying we've got to incorporate design engineering into our biology curriculum, because in the day of sequencing and cloning is over. I mean, we have machines that can do that. Now the hard part is upon us in terms of how these machines talk to each other, how they're integrated. It's no longer that you can just study translation in the cell, because that's hardwired into the cell division process, into DNA replication. All these things are feeding back to each other. If you've got a lot of energy source out there, then you increase the number of ribosomes in the cell, you increase your initiation of DNA replication, and you increase the rapidity in which you can divide. If conditions change, then the cell can respond to those changes subtly. So you've got this rheostat mechanism involved in terms of very subtle changes in the environment are being read and anticipated by the cell, and the appropriate responses are being made. The other point that you made, I think, is also good. You know, I have given a number of talks about irreducible complexity, the bacterial flagellum, looking at the evidence, pros and cons, and never once have to bring in, you know, God to the argument. In fact, in this debate that turned into a debate with Robert Pinnock, and I was just talking about irreducible complexity because he asked about it, and he said, then, who is a designer? Tell me who the designer is. Right now, in front of all these people, tell me who the designer is. And I said, well, Robert, why are you bringing religion into this conversation? I thought we were talking about science, you know. Let's go down the hall to the theologian, and we can discuss that. But recognize, and I said, recognize the audience. Who's interjecting theology into this conversation? Not me. I just wanted, you know, I'm just speaking about the science. So yeah, the evidence is there, and it is compelling. It goes back to what Mike was saying last night in Romans. God has revealed himself in what has been made, his very attributes. And if you read that further, we are without excuse, you know, in terms of how we interpret it. If we're going to erase the hand on the Sistine Chapel that's pointing down, you know, there are serious consequences to that.
Next question, yes.
Okay. In that I did not hear the whole of, what, did I do that? Okay. I didn't hear the whole of your talk. I was detained outdoors for a while, but I came in time to hear about stasis. And about how natural selection tends, rather than transforming things, tends to eliminate so-called intermediate forms because the incipient, as you said, or the intermediate steps are useless. So then what is to be made? For the sake of argument, if you go with that, then what is to be made of, say, organisms in the fossil record that appear to be intermediate creatures, like, say, the famous examples, Archaeopteryx, Ambulocetus, and the one that hits really close to home, Australopithecus. By the way, for those here who haven't heard of the second one, Ambulocetus is an almost 50 million year old animal that appears to be intermediary between land mammals and whales. So, what is to be made if natural selection tends to inhibit change? What's to be made of those and other apparent intermediary forms? And especially considering the fact that to this day, I have read, to this day, every so often whalers have pulled in a whale that has 2 teeny tiny itty bitty little back legs. Or, of course, there are the famous examples of human babies born with a little stub of a tail.
The pervasive patterns of natural history have been top-down, not bottom-up, and it appears as though there are major discontinuities in nature, natural discontinuities, which are not allowed by the philosophy of materialism, but that are an empirical possibility. Scott, do you care to answer Anything on that?
Do you want to deal with that? Okay. I'm not a paleontologist, but these are legitimate questions. But it's agreed that the fossil record is lacking in the intermediates. That Darwin assumed that that would just be a matter of time, and they've been far from showing themselves. We would predict that there would be a blending of orders and families, that you would find these intermediates, and they don't exist. Now, there are examples, Archaeopteryx, but Archaeopteryx appears to, in the fossil record after, from my understanding, birds first appeared, so it's somewhat of an anomaly. But also, too, I think that there's the human component of this as well. I think Mark Twain said it well, don't trust your eyes when your imagination is out of focus. Why is it every time there's an intermediate found, it makes the cover of Science or Nature or National Geographic? Evolution's a fact. The equivalent of this to me is that every time Bordetella pertussis is isolated from a human patient, it's like making the cover of the New York Times. The germ theory of disease, once again, is verified. No, we take it for granted, and it's a problem. These are legitimate things. I think there's evidence for change. It's a question of how much change, and nobody knows that. What is the genetic capacity of any organism to change? We don't have the answer. Now, there's a lot of diversity on this planet. We don't have a mechanism that I think is sufficient to explain it. Natural selection and mutation doesn't. We have microevolution, but I don't think this explains the complexifying mutations that are required to give us new strategies and body plans, etc. But I'm not a paleontologist, so that's an inadequate answer.
Well, sometimes on these transitional forms, the big print giveth and the little print taketh away. It's often a subject of further scientific research in science, and science will change through time. But thank you. Very good questions. Yes. Oh, yes, over here. Okay.
I was going to wait till lunchtime to just ask an informal question, but since we have all three of you up there, I thought I'd ask it right now. The term intelligent designer appears to become a fairly popular phrase over roughly at least the last 5 to 10 years. I was trying to do some reading that I've kept from the 70s and 80s, and I was actually trying to figure out before I came here to the seminar last night, where was that phrase, either intelligent designer first really used? And that's going to be my basic question, but I will tell you that I think it was 1984, if my memory's right, I should have brought it, but in 1984, our Art Batson up here did use the phrase in an article in a publication, intelligent, purposeful design. So if Art wasn't the first coiner, which he might have been a few years later, that I don't have all the articles that Art and others have written, that came darn close, but I was just wondering if anybody knows the actual first use of this very specific intelligent designer.
Wow, I guess you're asking the right guy. But he doesn't remember. Mutation in the brain here somewhere. Excuse me? Yeah, Nancy Piercy might know that here. I would say, let me say just a word or two about intelligent design. I think it's a logical inference, but it's a bridge, I think, more between science and theology. I don't like to think of it as a scientific theory. I tend to agree with Richard Lewin at the beginning that scientific theories must be naturalistic. Creation is not natural by definition, and therefore, if you want to, put that in the fine print or along the edge, or truth in advertising, that creation is excluded as a scientific by definition. It's excluded from the scientific community and enterprise, as much as it may be a very logical inference. I would fault the intelligent design community in focusing so much on evolution as much, the origin of species, that level, especially when evolution is used in so many different senses, from the evolution of the automobile and computer software, as I used before. Would that evolution have been possible without continuous intelligent input? The answer is clearly no. So evolution in this case infers intelligent design. I would rather approach this again systematically, beginning with the origin of the universe, the origin of life, the origin of genetic information. There's no controversy at all about the data that Michael Strauss raised last night regarding the fine-tuning, the moment of creation, that the universe has not always existed. If you want intelligent design, that occurs from the very start. And how can you have intelligent design of the entire cosmos and not have it contained in the details of that cosmos? So I've offended everybody now. Mike,
you haven't offended me yet.
You care to? I haven't offended you yet. Oh, we've got another questioner coming up here.
Get a chance.
A stranger, Dr. Mike Bowers from the Department of Chemistry, who I've never met before in my life, and I did not set up to. And I'll give you the $20 later for asking this question. I don't know what the question is, folks. Honest.
Yeah.
I'm done.
I have an evolutionary type question, but I think it's a bridging question between the two different points of view that have come forth in the first two lectures. Last night, Michael pointed out that things are actually made at the very beginning. Well, there's primarily energy, and then there was hydrogen and helium, and there had to be some sort of asymmetry in the sort of explosion of things to gather some of this matter together. If it was completely uniform, of course, there would not have ever been the formation of larger material bodies that form into galaxies, et cetera, this whole process, and I don't want to go through it again because it was very well done last night. But there was an aspect that wasn't carried all the way through, and that is it takes a certain amount of time, which was noted last night, but I want to go further with it, to make heavy elements. And the elements we're particularly concerned with here to tie the two together are the elements of life: carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, hydrogen. Hydrogen we always had, but and the time process it takes, for example, to make Earth. Let's not worry about the rest of the universe, let's just worry about Earth. The formation of Earth, its time in history when that was actually formed a number of billion years ago, and then the estimation of the time it took to form sufficient heavy elements for the Earth to cool, and then for the inorganic processes, because the only thing we had to start with, remember, were these few atoms, not connected as molecules, much too hot to have molecules of any kind, that had to form the simplest molecules, and then the combination through chemistry of those simplest molecules to start to form the simplest biological molecules. And the estimations of these processes put the Earth as way too young to have evolved the very complicated type of molecules that we see around us and that we are made of ourselves. And I'm going to go right to the end, then I'll let both of them comment on it. And because of this conundrum, it's now being postulated by people, of course, that can't come to accept the fact that there might have been, in fact, a focusing effect or a design effect here to inject anything into the system other than natural processes themselves, that life itself must have come from somewhere else in our solar system, possibly from Mars 1 billion years before, where it was maybe in the so-called Goldilocks zone, capable of forming life. And then it was brought through space, not as one, but as a whole series of bacteria, because of the complexity of life that's found here. There still wouldn't have been time. So I wonder if you comment on this sort of macro evolutionary process and the time scales involved with that. And primarily, I guess, Michael's who I'm asking the question to.
Why don't you start, because this is kind of what we talked about in the car.
Why don't you two take my place here?
I'm just interested in what you think.
Come in
Look at
close.
the quick time scale.
Right. The problem we have is our current estimation of the age of the Earth is 4.5 billion years, somewhere in that range. And we find life appearing very rapidly after it cooled down, which is a problem, because it's not that you've got 4.5 billion years to come up with replicating molecules and organisms. You've got a very narrow window in the course of estimates of 100 million to 200 million years. So now you've got a real paradox of how you can explain complex replicating organisms in such a short time frame. So to increase your probabilistic resources, which you have to do, all right, you've got to escape from that time constraint, then you displace it where it happens somewhere else, and or you have multiple universes such that you have accounted for the probabilistic problems associated with formation of life. Mike, do you want to add to that?
I just want to say, for the last 15 minutes, I've had this insatiable desire to go to the beach. I can't figure out why. So, yeah, I mean, this is true. Scientists are really wrestling with the short time scale to develop life, and so there are lots of ideas. One idea is that life develops someplace else in the universe. What is certainly true from an astronomical viewpoint is that matter is constantly getting displaced from different planets. In fact, there was this excitement when this Mars meteorite was found on Earth, and there was some disputed evidence that it might have contained life. Well, I think that we will eventually find microbial life forms on Mars, or at least evidence for them. Why? Because whenever the Earth is bombarded by a comet, it spits stuff out in the atmosphere, it leaves the Earth, and that stuff is scattered throughout the solar system. So we will eventually find evidence for microbial life other places in the solar system. And of course, the New York Times headline will say it came from Mars to Earth, rather than possibly the other way around, that it actually went from Earth to Mars. And that certainly there are mechanisms for allowing life to travel out. The other thing that Art said that I really liked was he didn't explicitly say that there was no possible naturalistic mechanism for some of this stuff to happen, even the origin of life. I mean, God finely tuned the universe, and when the physicists finally discovered the laws of nature that seemed to operate from the moment of the Big Bang, they used words like super intellect that monkeyed with the physics. Not being a biologist, I can therefore say anything I want about biology, and I won't be kicked out of the fraternity of scientists because it's not my field. But I think it's possible that God finely tuned the universe so well and developed within the universe even laws of nature that allow these very improbable things to happen, including possibly some kind of origin of life. And I don't know. This is the job of the scientists, to find out eventually how life developed. And if it's possible, or if it's true that God possibly developed some naturalistic laws that allowed these things to happen, because they are improbable and scientists realize that, then I think someday you will read biologists writing that a super intellect has monkeyed with the biology, rather than simply the physicists. The great thing about being a theist, or at least an agnostic, is it gives you the ability to investigate these ideas without any presuppositions. And I am free as a theist to investigate all the evidence, come to conclusion, and I'm not biased as to whether God used supernatural mechanisms or natural mechanisms. Either one points to designer. And so I'm excited. If I had to put my eggs in one basket, I personally believe that most of the mechanisms we're going to find for this intelligent design are natural. They're built into the laws of nature. They show the same fine-tuning as we see in the cosmos as a whole. And therefore, I don't think it will be natural selection or random mutation. But, this is great. We need people in science who are investigating these ideas like Scott is doing, because we as Christians, more than anybody else, should be the people searching for the truth without presuppositions as to where that truth will lead us, including the mechanism that God used to bring about the design.
I have a question. Are we ready for another question?
We can raise another question, yes.
I didn't know if you
Remember,
all wanted to-
I'm not paying you by the word.
Yeah, right. You're only paying him.
That's right.
All right. One concept of getting around these low probability events that we see is a self-direction. I mean, as a simple example of what I'm talking about is like there's 26 letters in the English alphabet. So if we talk about a letter being chosen, there's one chance in 26. However, if the previous letter was a Q, it's almost 100% that that letter will be a U. It's self-direct. The Q directed the next letter to be a U. Now, what about self-direction and that might be present that directs these very improbable events to take place?
I would say that what we see in biology, I'm going to toss this off to Scott here in just a moment. What we see in biology is not law-like, it's information. And DNA and the laws of genetics are not such that DNA is a result of law. I don't think it's a result of chance. It's information, which is in an entirely different category. And Scott, let me toss this over to you to respond to, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I think once you've got the system up and going, then you can allow for variation. But it comes back to this idea of what Art is saying is, where does information come from? You know, the genetic code is truly a code, and it's got punctuation, and it allows for, you know, an incredible amount of protein variation, etc. But at the same time, noise. But I'd have to think about your question. I think I don't want to pop off here without giving it a good thought, unless anyone else has considered this. Doug, I don't know. You jump in here too. We've got another biologist here that.
Come up to Mike.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm just saying, jump into the fray here if you want to. I think. Well, I'm going to stop there.
And I guess I'd say in his example, you know, if the Q is followed by a U, then it's not truly independent, and so you really don't have any more information there. You have, I mean, you could remove the Q, remove the U, and you still have the same quantity of information.
Excellent point.
So if you have anything where it dictates something else in the information, it's not really independent from that, and so you can reduce it. You can sort of compress it down to less information, and so I think in that sense, you know, you're not creating information. You're merely expanding information, and then going the other way, you're compressing it. But that doesn't really tell you where it came from.
Yeah, the U following the Q is an example of the law of the English language. But you cannot generate information if the next letter must be something else, and the next letter must be something else. Formation of a crystal is a result of laws. The formation of DNA, well, we're talking about information here. We can explain the chemistry of ink on paper very well. That's the laws of chemistry. But we cannot explain the content of that information. I did have a conversation one time. This is just a quick aside before lunch. Hope it doesn't ruin your appetite. He said, I've got an explanation for the entire works of Shakespeare. And took a bottle of ink, said, we can evolve the entire works of Shakespeare from the simplest first grade book. Took a bottle of ink, threw it up against the wall. Said, look, see Spot. Waited a little while. Look, see Spot run. A little while later, the janitor came out with a scrub brush and his, how damn Spot. Obviously, we had the transitional stages all the way from the first grade reader to Shakespeare, and the rest is just detail.
Someone may have asked a question about the Human Genome Project earlier, but it'd be nice to have Francis Collins here since he shares Christian faith. But as I understand it, that project is ongoing, and not only the human genome, but baboons and chimpanzees, and top down shows amazing relationships between the DNA of life forms, even down to mice and so on, where you have huge areas of conservation where these animals are making proteins that are very similar. It seems to me that, if it's an open universe, that shouldn't be surprising. But does anybody want to comment on, where you think that sort of evidence is going? Collins definitely would fall in sort of a theistic evolution category. Wouldn't disagree, I think, with what Michael said just a few minutes ago. But what's your take on it?
I mean, that's a fact. We can look at proteins in bacteria, heat shock proteins, and we find we have the same ones. It's an argument from my presentation of homology. We find it at structural, looking at bone structures in different mammals and showing, the bat wing versus our hand or a whale fin. Biochemical, we share different biochemical or similar biochemical pathways. We catabolize glucose like many unicellular organisms. Conservation of DNA information. Genomes, if you look at, I think it's now, we have over 300 genomes done for bacteria. And one of the first ones outside of Haemophilus and E. coli that were done were the archaea, which appeared to be an intermediate organism between eukaryotic and prokaryotes based on their ribosomal RNA sequence conservation. But as we have entire genomes, that has to be reassessed. It looks like they are true prokaryotes, although they have some differences. If you look at even the conservation of the position of genes on the chromosome seem to be conserved. The bottom line is that the argument of homology is a self-referential argument. Okay, it's almost a circular argument. It doesn't preclude design in the process. If you have a design that works, you're going to apply it to more than one system. I mean, engineers do this all the time. And so the point being, although homology is used as an argument to support evolution, I think when you really distill it down, it can be interpreted either way. But one points to the direction that you want your answer to follow, the other is contradictory. Okay. But again, the point being that it's a self-referential argument. I assume common descent, therefore proteins have to have similar sequence, or DNA has to have similar sequence, and then I find similar DNA sequence, therefore common descent is true. I think when you take logic, that's frowned upon.
Yeah, just a couple quick comments before we wrap up. Simon Conway Morris, paleontologist, has observed that convergence, well, biologists have noticed this as well for many, many decades, convergence is everywhere. That is, we find common features. The eye of an octopus, the human eye. The eye has arisen 40 different times, but it didn't arise once and evolve by common ancestry? No, there's a convergence in nature, and his argument is that evolution is not the result of chance. The result. How could nature have converged on these same solutions so much? Second point is I was discussing this matter with a computer scientist from Microsoft yesterday. I said, Dave, look, I just bought Microsoft Word 7, and look at the code in this. It's just like 6 with a few modifications, and yet you're making me purchase this for how much money? There's obviously no intelligent design in this. Look at these bugs. He says, "Oh, bugs, those are features." Well, my point here is that computer scientists using intelligence would not start from scratch on something with Microsoft Word 7, not using the code that existed in Microsoft Word 6. And I think an intelligent designer would do exactly the same thing. And I might mention that when it comes to the differences between humans and the rest of the animal world, that God was very intelligent in waiting until the very last moment to give one free will. And with that, I will close.
Okay, let's thank them again.
Mike.